going to show you a couple of ways of making a ring fit someone with a swollen knuckle or arthritis, and this method requires two balls on the inside of the shank to stop it moving around once it's on the finger, and this method is making a hinged ring. So hinge there, it's got a clasp like that, it's really firm as well. Check it out. It's sometimes the case that if you've got a customer with a swollen knuckle or arthritis and you've sized the ring, then once it's in place it just rolls around, especially if it's got a large head on the ring like that, so you'll find it'll just find its way that way or that way, so be a nuisance. So the way to combat that is to make a couple of ball grips to go on the inside of the shank, and what that does is you're able to put the ring on sideways and it goes on okay, and twist it into position, and those grips hold on to the soft part of the finger there and it stays in place. So that's the first suggestion I make if I've got a customer with that issue. So I'm going to show you how I do that. First of all, you've got to locate the dead center of the under part of the shank there, the bottom part there. So what I do is I just place my saw blade across the ring and just visualize that center point, so you just make sure it's perfectly symmetrical either side, and then a little nick backwards like that, not enough to cut into the metal but just to be able to see where the middle part is. And I found that a setting of around about 9mm, 8 to 9mm on your dividers should be about right for where the balls go. So from that point I'm just going to mark on the side of the shank there and there, and those measurements depend also on the size of the ring. Using a round burr of around about 2.2mm, there again depending on the width of the shank, and also be just wary of where the hallmark is as well. So you don't want to burr into any markings on the inside, so you might have to adjust that measurement I gave you for your dividers if that's the case. So with a ball burr that's a little bit narrower than the width of the shank, then just where that scratch mark is, going right in the middle, and I'm just going to burr a little divot there. So get the ball burr going before you make contact with the ring, and then do the other side. So wherever those divots are, that's exactly where your balls are going to be. So if you're slightly off center, then your ball's going to settle into the divot and be slightly off center. So make your correction now with a little bit of flux, and I'll just show you the flux that I use, although I will be doing a video on flux because I've been asked quite a few times about the flux I use, and it is a really good one, this one. So this is called Tenacity 4A flux paste, and it's made by a company called Johnson Matthey. So there's probably alternatives out there, but it's the paste that I prefer rather than the liquid O-flux or the borax cone and dish. So now I've got my flux settled into the little divots there. What I'm going to do now is prepare some wire. So I've got some wire here I've rolled down and drawn down, and it's 0.9 of a mil thick. Now it's not crucial, that measurement, because we're going to ball it, and we're going to judge the size of the ball as we make it. But what you really need to do is clean the wire with some emery first to make sure that the flux you put on is going to stick. So just paint it on, and we'll go over to the solder block now, and I'm going to be using some charcoal. Just find a clean part of the block first. It's probably ready to be replaced, this. So I'm just going to put a little divot in there. I'll put two. Now you can pre-cut your pieces and ball them that way, but if you're not sure what size you're going to do them, there again that depends on the job in hand, they're not all going to be the same, then the best way to do it is to hold your wire in a pair of tweezers upside down, and I'm looking at it sideways here so I can see exactly how big the balls are getting as I'm going. So just apply a nice oxidizing flame on the bottom there, let it roll up. Now if it gets too big it'll drop off, but I'm just looking at it now and I'm going to just have a break. Once it's like that, I'm just going to place it on my ring and make that judgment now whether that is going to be big enough to do the job. And I have had cases where I've made that judgment, soldered it in, and the customer's tried it and come back because it's still rolling a little bit, so I've had to just replace them, but it's an easy enough thing to do. Now I think that needs to be a fraction bigger, so what I'm going to do, it's cool enough now, is cut it off with about 1 mil or so more. It's got a little tail on it and that will ball a little bit bigger. I'm just going to leave it there for a second whilst I ball the other one, and I'll look at what I've just done to make sure I get the right size. Lovely, that's the right size. So I'm going to just let that cool for a minute. Now using silver, it conducts heat quite rapidly, so that's going to be really hot all the way up to there, so I'm just going to let that cool for a second before I touch it down there. Now I'll put my little pieces in the charcoal divots that I did, and I'm just making sure they're still nicely fluxed, especially where I've just cut them, and I'm going to heat it up and apply a bit more flux as well, because this is the point that I'm going to solder to the ring top point. Let that blob down, form the ball, it's just rolling a little bit, just move it back up. It's gone into an egg shape, which is quite interesting. Pop that back in there. Okay, that's a perfect ball now, it's just rolling around nicely in that divot. Before the flux dries completely, I'll just take it out, otherwise it sticks in there and you'll be pulling out charcoal with it. And get the other one done, try and stop it rolling around. There we go. So what I'm after are two nice clean surfaces, because I'm not going to put this in acid, because it's just a wee bit tricky trying to pick the balls out, and if we've got two clean surfaces we don't really need to flux it, to pickle it. So that surface looks good, and yeah, I can use that as well. So I just want to make sure they cool off, and I'll pick off that bit of charcoal that's just stuck on there. Now I've got the ring held in a third hand that's on a stand, and I put the ring quite far up the third hand, and the reason being is that I want the heat that's going to travel up the shank there to sink into the steel of the tweezers there, and that will protect the head a little bit more. Now these are just CZs, so they'll take the heat alright, but if you had more vulnerable stones, then you would try and protect them as much as possible. So this is one way. There is another way, and I'll go into it with another lesson, and that's using a heat paste that draws the heat from the stones. it's hard for me to recommend something like that because there's never a guarantee when you're working with stones. They're natural, so they can decide for themselves if they're going to damage sometimes. And so now I've got my two little bits of solder, and there I'm using easy solder, taking no risks, and just pick it up with my solder pick and just put it into the little divot on one side, not let it melt yet, or I'll just put the other one in there on the other side. And now I'll just add a little bit more gas to the flame and just allow the solder to run, and it should just pull into the little divot there. And the tweezers are doing the job because it's taken a while to get it up to temperature, so it's sinking quite well. I'm going to have to apply a little bit more gas and air. So there we go, so that's pulled in there now, and same on the other side. Now I've tilted the ring, so I'm going to let gravity help me here. So I've got one of the divots there at the bottom, and I'm just going to dip my little ball into a bit of flux just where it's got the clean surface, and pop it in place. Now the solder, once it starts running, does something called capillary action, which is it almost sucks it into place. So you'll see in a minute it'll just move into place. Applying the heat mainly to the shank. You can see the solder's just starting to run now, and it's just sucked it into the divot there. So I'll give you a chance to have a closer look at the next one. I'll just turn it so that I've got it directly underneath, and just put the ball in a little bit of flux again. Pop it in position as close to the divot as possible. The flame's concentrating. I've got a neutral flame as well, and I'm concentrating the heat just on the shank there, because if I apply it directly to where the solder is, the ball will start sweating and maybe start melting as well. So I'll just allow the solder to liquefy, and then it, as before, it will suck the ball into position. There we go. So just make sure there's a nice shine around the joint there, so the solder's done its job, and that's it. So if you made the ball correctly, you'll only need to polish that once it's been in the pickle. I'm going to allow it to cool, so if I quench that with stones, and even the CZs will break up, so just make sure you allow it to cool first. I generally find that this method is the most efficient way of getting a ring to go onto a swollen. I generally find that this method is the most efficient way of solving the problem of getting the ring over a swollen knuckle and holding it in place. So that's what I'd do first, but there is another way of doing it, and that's to make a hinge and catch for a shank, and that's what I'm going to show you next.